Now, if you've never witnessed three juvenile Velkari predators having what can only be described as the galaxy's most destructive temper tantrum, consider yourself fortunate. And if you've never seen a dozen heavily armed security officers reduced to running around like caffeinated squirrels by said predators, well, you're about to get an education in cosmic comedy. The Galactic Naval Academy's Exotic Species Wing had been having what administrators would later diplomatically call a challenging morning, which was rather like calling a supernova a bit bright or a black hole somewhat clingy. The reality was that containment protocols had gone from routine feeding time to all hands on deck. We're probably going to die, in roughly the time it takes to say, oops. Three Velkari cubs, each about the size of a terrestrial panther, but with crystalline claws that could slice through reinforced duranium like butter through, well, butter, had decided that their pristine habitat dome was far too boring for their tastes. What they wanted, apparently, was to redecorate the entire facility in a style that could best be described as apocalyptic chic. The first sign of trouble had been when Cadet Zoey noticed the unusual silence from the Predator wing during her morning rounds. Zoey was a third-year xenobiology student, with an unfortunate habit of asking questions that made her professors uncomfortable, and a reputation for solving problems in ways that made the administration nervous. She had been cataloging dietary preferences for her thesis when the quiet struck her as wrong. Velkari cubs were many things: dangerous, intelligent, occasionally murderous, but they were never quiet. Their natural state involved a constant stream of chittering, growling, and what xenobiologists had classified as aggressive purring. Silence from a Velkari enclosure was like silence from a daycare center, technically possible, but usually indicating that something had gone horribly, catastrophically wrong. Zoey had barely reached the observation deck when the first explosion echoed through the corridors. Well, she muttered, watching as emergency lights began strobing throughout the facility. That's not supposed to happen. The cubs had apparently decided that the reinforced transparisteel viewing barrier was more of a suggestion than an actual obstacle. The first breach had been almost artistic in its precision, a perfect circular hole that suggested the cubs had been planning this for some time. The second and third holes were less artistic and more enthusiastic. By the time the first security team arrived, the cubs were already loose in the main corridor, and they seemed to be having the time of their lives. Commander Vexundra, a saurian whose scales typically maintained a calm jade green, was currently shifting through a spectacular array of colors that would have been beautiful if they hadn't indicated extreme stress. Her communication device crackled, with increasingly frantic reports. Security Team Alpha to command. The subjects have breached secondary containment. Repeat, we have a code black situation in Exotic Wing. Define code black. Vexundra's voice carried the kind of forced calm that suggested she was about to start eating furniture. Ma'am, they're laughing. And indeed, the distinctive chittering sound that passed for Velkari laughter was echoing through the ventilation system. It was a sound that made evolutionary sense, as Velkari were pack hunters whose laughter typically preceded something very unpleasant happening to their prey. The cubs seemed to find the security response absolutely hilarious. "Deploying sonic deterrence," came another voice over the comm. The laughter stopped for about 3 seconds. Then it resumed with what could only be described as increased enthusiasm. "Sonic deterrents are ineffective, Commander." Zoey, who had positioned herself at a relatively safe observation point, watched as 6 heavily armored security officers rounded the corner at a dead run, followed by what appeared to be a small, furry tornado with claws. The Cubs had clearly decided that chase was the best game ever invented, and the security team was providing excellent entertainment. "This is Qualmoth." A new voice buzzed through the communicators, the insectoid chief of security sounding remarkably like someone gargling gravel. "I'm implementing Containment Protocol 6-6. "Sir," one of the security officers panted over the comm while diving behind a support pillar. "Protocol 6-6 requires the subjects to actually respond to containment fields." "And they're not?" "Sir, they appear to be playing with the containment fields." Zoey leaned forward, watching as one of the cubs, a particularly sleek specimen with silver-tipped fur, seemed to be deliberately triggering the energy barriers just to watch them flare to life. Each time the field activated, the cub would leap backward, crouch low, then pounce at it again. Classic play behavior, if you knew what to look for. "They're juveniles," she said to herself, loud enough that her comm unit picked it up. "Say again, Cadet?" Vexundra's voice crackled through. "Nothing, Commander. Just observing." But it wasn't nothing. Zoey had spent the better part of 2 years studying predator behavior, and what she was seeing didn't match the security reports. The cubs weren't hunting. They weren't establishing territory. They weren't even being particularly destructive, despite the alarms and flashing lights. They were playing. More specifically, they were playing a game that involved making the large, scary bipeds run around and make interesting noises. Every security protocol was being interpreted as part of the game, and the cubs were winning spectacularly. Another explosion echoed through the facility, followed by what sounded like applause. Velkari applause, which involved rapid claw-clicking against hard surfaces. "Commander!" Qualmoth's voice was taking on the kind of edge that suggested someone was about to make career-limiting decisions. "I'm authorizing the use of neural dampeners." Zoey's blood ran cold. Neural dampeners were typically reserved for adult Velkari, who had gone fully feral. They worked by essentially shutting down higher brain functions until the subject was reduced to basic autonomic responses. On adults, the effects were temporary. On juveniles— "Sir, requesting permission to—" she started. "All non-essential personnel are to evacuate the exotic wing immediately." Vexundra cut her off. "This is not a request." Zoey looked down at her comm unit, then at the chaos unfolding below. The cubs had discovered that they could trigger multiple containment fields simultaneously by running in complex patterns, creating a light show that they seemed to find endlessly entertaining. Their chittering had taken on a musical quality, almost like singing. They were having fun, possibly the first fun they'd had in days. She thought about the neural dampeners, about what they would do to developing Velkari brains, about how the cubs' play song would stop forever. "Sorry, Commander," she said, switching off her comm unit. "I think I'll stay right here." The security teams were regrouping for another attempt, this time with heavier equipment. Energy weapons that could stun a full-grown Velkari warrior were being prepped for use against cubs who probably weighed less than she did. From her vantage point, Zoey could see something the security teams couldn't. The cubs weren't random in their movements. They were staying together, always keeping each other in sight. When one got too close to actual danger, the others would call out warning chirps. They were scared. Under all that playful chaos, they were absolutely terrified. "Oh, you beautiful, ridiculous creatures," she whispered, watching as the smallest of the 3 cubs, one with distinctive white patches around its eyes, carefully avoided stepping on a maintenance drone that had been knocked over in the chaos. "What happened to you?" If there's one thing that can be said about military protocol, it's that it has all the flexibility of a neutronium brick. When Plan A fails, The natural response is not to reconsider the approach, but to implement Plan A with more firepower, louder voices, and a significantly higher chance of collateral damage, which is exactly what Chief Security Officer Qualmoth was doing. "Bring in the heavy containment units," his buzzing voice commanded over the intercom system. "And get me a xenobiologist. A real one, not some academy student with theories." Zoey, still perched in her observation alcove with her comm unit, decidedly switched off, watched as the situation went from mildly catastrophic to spectacularly disastrous in the space of about 10 minutes. The heavy containment units turned out to be devices roughly the size of refrigerators, bristling with enough energy projectors to power a small starship. They moved on repulsor fields with all the grace and subtlety of falling asteroids, humming with barely contained power that made the air itself taste metallic. The Cubs took one look at these new toys and practically vibrated with excitement. "Oh no," Zoey breathed, watching as the smallest cub, the one with white patches she'd started thinking of as patches, crouched low and began stalking one of the containment units like it was the most interesting prey animal in the universe. The first unit powered up with a whine that could be heard 3 decks away. Energy crackled between its projectors as it attempted to create a containment field large enough to encompass all 3 Cubs simultaneously. What it actually accomplished was providing the Cubs with what appeared to be the most entertaining light show of their young lives. They danced. There was no other word for it. The 3 Cubs began an intricate, synchronized movement pattern that had them weaving in and out of the energy beams like they were performing some ancient ritual. Every time a beam passed over them, their crystalline claws would glow with reflected energy, creating a cascade of rainbow patterns across the corridor walls. "Containment Unit 1 is not containing anything," reported a security officer who sounded like he was having an existential crisis. "They're dancing," another voice added, with the kind of bewildered tone typically reserved for announcing that the laws of physics had just been repealed. Qualmoth's response was predictable. "Deploy Unit 2. The second containment unit approached from a different angle, attempting to bracket the Cubs between 2 overlapping fields. The Cubs responded by including the new light patterns in their performance, creating an even more complex routine that would have been breathtaking if it weren't also completely undermining any semblance of institutional authority. "Sir," came a hesitant voice over the comm, "they appear to be showing off?" Indeed, the largest of the Cubs, a magnificent specimen with dark fur that seemed to absorb light, had discovered that certain movements would cause the energy fields to pulse in rhythm. He was now conducting an impromptu light symphony, with his siblings providing backup choreography. Zoey found herself genuinely impressed. Velkari Cubs were intelligent, but this level of pattern recognition and creative response suggested they were significantly brighter than the standard profiles indicated. It also suggested they were bored out of their minds. "Commander," Qualmoth's voice carried the edge of someone whose carefully laid plans were being demolished by creatures who should, by all rights, be cowering in terror, requesting permission to implement Protocol 9. Zoey didn't know what Protocol 9 was, but the sudden silence that greeted this request suggested it wasn't good. "Chief, Protocol 9 is designed for hostile adult specimens." Vexundra's voice finally crackled through the comm. Her earlier color shifting now escalated to what looked like a migraine-inducing light show. "These are juveniles. Juveniles who have now breached 4 separate containment systems and are treating our security measures like personal entertainment." As if to emphasize his point, one of the Cubs, the middle-sized one with particularly prominent ear tufts she dubbed ears, chose that moment to leap directly through a containment beam somersault in midair, and land with what could only be described as a theatrical bow. The other two cubs chittered their approval, a sound that was becoming increasingly grating to everyone except Zoey, who was beginning to understand the nuances of Velkari communication. They weren't just playing. They were trying to communicate. "Permission granted," Vexundra said finally, her scales now cycling through colors that suggested she was either about to molt or have a nervous breakdown. But keep it on minimum settings. Protocol 9, as it turned out, involved flooding the area with a cocktail of pheromones designed to trigger submission responses in Velkari neural chemistry. The theory was sound, based on extensive research into pack hierarchy behaviors. The practice? Well, the practice involved watching 3 juvenile Velkari simultaneously sneeze, shake their heads like they were trying to dislodge something unpleasant, and then turn to look directly at the observation deck where the command staff was stationed. If looks could kill, the combined glare from those 6 predatory eyes would have vaporized the entire command structure. "They don't like that," Zoey murmured to herself, noting how the cubs' playful chittering had stopped entirely, replaced by a low growling that seemed to resonate in frequencies that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primitive brainstem. The cubs were no longer playing. Now they were angry. "Sir, the pheromone deployment appears to have been counterproductive," came a voice that was trying very hard to maintain professional composure while probably watching several tons of irritated predators stalking toward his position. The dark-furred cub, the apparent leader, began a sound that Zoey had read about but never heard. A subsonic rumble that Velkari used to coordinate pack attacks. It was a sound that made humans instinctively want to find high ground and sharp sticks. "All personnel fall back to secondary positions," Qualmoth ordered, his buzzing voice now carrying overtones of panic. "Implement containment barrier Alpha through Gamma." What followed was a masterclass in how not to handle intelligent predators. Energy barriers sprang to life throughout the corridor, creating a maze of crackling walls designed to funnel the cubs into a smaller containment area. The theory was textbook perfect. The reality was that the cubs had apparently been paying attention during their previous encounters with energy barriers and had learned a few things. They began systematically testing each barrier, not with the playful curiosity they'd shown earlier, but with focused, methodical intelligence. Patches discovered that the barriers had a slight delay when powering up after being triggered. Ears found that they could be overloaded by simultaneous contact at multiple points. And the Dark Leader, who Zoey had started calling Shadow, worked out the timing needed to slip through the gaps between overlapping fields. In less than 5 minutes, they had not only escaped the containment maze, but had somehow managed to disable half the barriers entirely. "How are they doing this?" Vexundra's voice carried the kind of frustration that suggested someone was about to start making very poor decisions. "They're juveniles. They shouldn't have this level of tactical awareness." Zoey could have answered that question. Velkari cubs learned through play, and every single security response had been teaching them exactly how the Academy's systems worked. They were essentially getting a graduate-level education in containment countermeasures, with each failed protocol providing new data for their developing tactical minds. But she couldn't answer because her comm unit was still switched off, and honestly, she wasn't sure anyone would listen anyway. "Sir," came a new voice, one she didn't recognize. "This is Dr. Voth from Xenopsychology. I've been monitoring the situation, and I believe I can provide some insight." Finally, Zoey thought, someone with actual expertise instead of just bigger weapons. "The cubs appear to be exhibiting stress-induced hyperactivity," Dr. Voth continued, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had never actually seen a Velkari cub reduce a security team to whimpering shadows of their former selves. I recommend a graduated approach using sonic pacification combined with targeted neurochemical intervention. Zoey closed her eyes. Sonic pacification was essentially the audio equivalent of a neural dampener, designed to overwhelm the subject's sensory processing until they became docile. On adults, it was unpleasant but manageable. On juveniles, with developing neural pathways. Initiating sonic pacification, came the announcement. The sound that filled the corridor was beyond description. It was the audio equivalent of being inside a collapsing star, a frequency designed to bypass conscious thought and directly trigger submission reflexes. It was the sound of nightmares given form and amplified through military-grade speakers. The cubs' response was immediate and terrifying. They screamed, not the chittering communication sounds they'd been making, not the rumbling pack coordination calls, but actual screams of pain and fear that seemed to come from some primal place that transcended species boundaries. It was a sound that made every human within hearing distance instinctively want to make it stop, regardless of the consequences. The screaming lasted exactly 11 seconds before the cubs did something that no one had anticipated. They synchronized their crystalline claws to the sonic frequency and began systematically destroying every piece of electronic equipment within reach. The lights went out first, followed by the artificial gravity generators, then the atmospheric recycling systems, and finally, mercifully, the sonic pacification system itself. In the sudden, blessed silence that followed, Commander Vexundra's voice carried a quality that suggested she had just watched her career prospects die a violent death. "Someone," she said, with the kind of calm that preceded either enlightenment or total psychological breakdown, "please tell me we have a Plan B." From her position in the now dark observation alcove, Zoey looked down at the three cubs, who were huddled together in the center of the corridor, no longer playing, no longer angry, just three young creatures who were probably wondering why the large bipeds kept trying to hurt them. "Actually," she said to the empty air around her, "I think I might." There are moments in life when the absolutely worst possible decision is also the only right one. Zoey was having one of those moments as she stood up from her hiding spot, brushed the dust off her academy uniform, and began walking toward the access hatch that would take her directly into the corridor with three traumatized, highly intelligent predators who had just demonstrated their ability to dismantle military-grade equipment with their bare claws. Her plan, such as it was, consisted of one lunch ration, a bottle of water, and what her xenobiology professor would have called a catastrophic misunderstanding of proper safety protocols. The corridor was eerily quiet now, emergency lighting casting long shadows that made everything look like a scene from a horror movie. The cubs were still huddled together in the center of the space, their earlier playfulness completely gone. They looked small, which was ridiculous, because each of them could probably take down a grown human without breaking a sweat. But there was something about their posture, the way they pressed against each other for comfort, that reminded Zoey powerfully of frightened children. "This is probably the stupidest thing I've ever done," she muttered to herself, then louder. "And considering some of my previous decisions, that's really saying something." The access hatch opened with a soft, pneumatic hiss that, in the current silence, sounded like a gunshot. All three cubs immediately spun toward the sound, crystalline claws extending instinctively, eyes reflecting the emergency lighting like mirrors. Zoey stepped through the hatch and did something that would later be analyzed by xenopsychologists for decades to come. She smiled. Not the nervous, placating smile of someone trying to avoid being eaten. Not the condescending smile of someone who thought they were dealing with dumb animals. Just a genuine, warm, human smile of the sort that had been making friends across the galaxy for the past 3 centuries. Then she sat down cross-legged in the middle of the corridor, pulled out her lunch ration, and began unwrapping it with the casual air of someone settling in for a pleasant picnic. The cubs stared at her. Zoey stared back, still smiling, and took a bite of what the Academy generously called a nutritional sandwich, but which more closely resembled compressed cardboard with delusions of flavor. "You know," she said conversationally, as if addressing 3 of the most dangerous juvenile predators in known space was the most natural thing in the universe. "This has been a really weird morning. I was supposed to be cataloging dietary preferences, which is honestly about as exciting as watching paint dry in a vacuum, and instead I get to witness what might be the most spectacular failure of institutional authority in Academy history." She took another bite of her sandwich, chewed thoughtfully, and continued. "Don't get me wrong, you 3 put on quite a show. That bit with the light symphony? Pure artistry. I particularly liked the synchronized somersault finale. Very dramatic." The cubs had not moved. They were still in their defensive cluster, but their claws had retracted slightly, and their ears, which had been pinned back in fear and anger, were beginning to swivel toward her voice. "The thing is," Zoey continued, pulling out a second sandwich and setting it on the floor between herself and the cubs, "I've been watching you for the past hour, and I don't think you're actually trying to hurt anyone. Which is weird, because everyone else seems convinced you're planning some kind of predatory rampage." She paused, tilting her head as if considering this. "But here's the thing about humans. We're really, really good at recognizing when someone is just scared and acting out. It's kind of our specialty. We've been doing it with our own species for millennia, and it turns out the skill transfers pretty well." Patches, the smallest cub with the white markings, took a tentative step forward, then stopped as if surprised by his own movement. "That's right," Zoey said gently, not moving toward him, but not backing away either. "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm not going to try to contain you or pacify you, or do any of the other unpleasant things that the well-meaning but fundamentally clueless security teams have been attempting." She unwrapped the second sandwich completely and tore off a piece, holding it out toward Patches. "I'm just going to sit here and share my lunch, because honestly, you look like you could use a friend right about now." The silence stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then Patches took another step forward, his movement so careful and deliberate it was almost painful to watch. "That's it," Zoey murmured encouragingly. "I know I'm not much to look at, and I definitely don't smell right to your standards, but I promise I'm harmless. Well, mostly harmless. I did set fire to my chemistry lab last semester, but that was entirely accidental, and only happened once. Twice, if you count the incident with the unstable molecular compounds, but that was really more of an explosion than a fire, so I don't think it counts." Patches was now close enough that Zoey could see the individual whiskers on his snout twitching as he analyzed her scent. Slowly, carefully, she extended her hand with the piece of sandwich, keeping her movements smooth and non-threatening. "I'm not sure if this is compatible with your dietary requirements," she said softly, "but it's what I've got, and sometimes sharing food is more about the gesture than the actual nutrition." Patches stretched his neck forward, sniffed delicately at the offered food, then, with infinite care, accepted it from her fingers. His touch was surprisingly gentle, the crystalline claws barely making contact with her skin. "Well, look at that," Zoey said, genuine delight coloring her voice. "You've got beautiful manners. Someone taught you well." At the mention of teaching, something changed in the cub's posture. Ears, the middle-sized cub, made a soft sound that was almost like a question, while Shadow, the large dark leader, took his first steps toward Zoey. "Oh," she breathed, understanding flooding through her like cold water. "Oh, you beautiful heartbroken creatures. Someone was taking care of you, weren't they? Someone you trusted? Someone you bonded with? And they're gone?" Shadow reached her now, settling into a crouch just within arm's reach. Up close, Zoey could see that his dark fur wasn't uniformly black, but rather a deep blue-black that caught the light in subtle patterns. His eyes, which had seemed so predatory from a distance, held an intelligence that was both alien and startlingly familiar. "Where's your handler?" she asked gently, reaching out to offer him another piece of sandwich. "What happened to the person who was supposed to be taking care of you?" Shadow accepted the food, then did something that made Zoey's heart break a little. He looked toward one of the corridor entrances and made a soft, questioning chirp. The same sound, Zoey realized, that he'd been making periodically throughout the morning's chaos. He was calling for someone who wasn't going to come. "Oh, sweetie," she whispered, understanding flooding through her. "They didn't just reassign your handler, did they? They didn't bother with a proper transition. They just took them away." Ears had joined them now, completing the circle. All three cubs were within touching distance, their earlier aggression completely gone, replaced by something that looked heartbreakingly like hope. Zoey set down her water bottle and the remaining sandwiches, then opened her arms in a gesture that was pure instinct. "Come here," she said softly. "All of you. It's okay. I know it's not the same, and I know I'm not who you're looking for, but sometimes a hug helps anyway." What happened next would be debated in xenopsychology journals for years to come. Three juvenile Velkari predators, each capable of reducing a grown human to component parts, carefully arranged themselves around the Academy cadet and settled into what could only be described as a group hug. The purring started quietly, a subsonic rumble that Zoey felt more than heard. It was the sound of contentment, of safety, of creatures who had been alone and afraid, finally finding comfort. "There we go," she murmured, gently stroking Shadow's head, while Patches curled up against her side and Ears draped himself across her legs like the universe's most dangerous lap cat. "That's so much better, isn't it?" From somewhere above them, she could hear voices over the communication system, confused and amazed voices trying to understand what they were seeing through the security monitors. "The human cadet appears to be cuddling with the subjects," came one bewildered report. "Define cuddling," Commander Vexundra's voice crackled through the speakers. "Ma'am, I don't know how else to describe it. They're all just sitting together. The cubs appear to be content." Zoey looked up toward where she knew the security cameras were positioned and gave them a little wave with her free hand. "This is Cadet Zoey speaking," she called out clearly. "I think we might have misunderstood the nature of the problem here." "Cadet." Qualmoth's buzzing voice carried a mixture of relief and exasperation. "Please explain your assessment of the situation." Zoey looked down at the three cubs, who were now completely relaxed against her, their crystalline claws retracted, their breathing deep and even. "They're not aggressive, Chief. They're grieving. Someone they trusted was taken away without warning, and they've been acting out because they're scared and confused, and don't understand why their person isn't coming back." She paused, gently scratching behind Ears' tufted appendages in a spot that made him purr even louder. They weren't trying to hurt anyone. They were trying to get attention, trying to make someone notice that something was wrong. Every security response just convinced them that all the bipeds were hostile, so they kept escalating their behavior to try to communicate. The silence from the comm system stretched for a long moment before Vexundra's voice returned, considerably more subdued than before. "Cadet, are you telling me that this entire incident was caused by improper transition protocols?" Zoey looked around at the damaged corridor, the disabled security systems, the emergency lighting, and the 3 utterly peaceful predators currently using her as furniture. "Commander," she said with a smile that could be heard in her voice, "I think that's exactly what I'm telling you. If there's one thing that can be said about institutional embarrassment, it's that it tends to generate a lot of paperwork, and even more uncomfortable silences. The kind of silences that stretch out like taffy, while everyone involved tries to figure out exactly how they're going to explain this particular catastrophe to their superiors." Commander Vexundra's scales had finally settled on a steady shade of deep purple that suggested she was processing some very unpleasant realizations about Academy protocols. Chief Security Officer Qualmoth's compound eyes were doing that rapid flutter thing that indicated his species' equivalent of a migraine. And somewhere in the administrative offices, Zoey was fairly certain several bureaucrats were having the kind of morning that would require large quantities of whatever their species considered therapeutic beverages. But for the moment, none of that mattered, because she was sitting in a damaged corridor with 3 of the most dangerous creatures in known space, and they were all taking a nap. Patches had somehow managed to drape himself across her shoulders like a furry clawed shawl, his breathing deep and even against her neck. Ears had claimed her lap entirely, his substantial weight making her legs go numb, but she didn't have the heart to disturb him. And Shadow, the apparent pack leader, had positioned himself as a living barrier between Zoey and the corridor entrance, his protective instincts clearly extending to his new human friend. "Cadet," Vexundra's voice came through the comm system with the careful tone of someone walking through a minefield. "We need to discuss proper extraction procedures." Zoey looked down at the peaceful cubs and tried to imagine any extraction procedure that wouldn't result in them going right back into panic mode. "With respect, Commander," she said quietly, mindful of the sleeping predators, "I think maybe we need to discuss what happened to their original handler first." The silence that followed this suggestion was the kind that indicated someone had just asked exactly the right question at exactly the wrong time. "Their handler," came a new voice over the comm, one that carried the particular brand of nervousness associated with middle management trying to avoid responsibility, "was reassigned to the Deep Space Survey Division 3 days ago. Standard personnel rotation." "Standard rotation," Zoey repeated, her voice carrying the kind of dangerous calm that her professors had learned to recognize as a warning sign. "And the transition protocols for the cubs?" Another silence, this one somehow more guilty than the last. "The cubs were classified as low-maintenance subjects," the voice continued, now sounding like someone confessing to accidentally detonating a small planet. "The assumption was that they would adapt quickly to new caretaking staff." Zoey closed her eyes and counted to 10 in 3 different languages, a technique she'd learned after the 3rd time she'd gotten into academic trouble for pointing out administrative incompetence a bit too enthusiastically. "Someone," she said with admirable restraint, "classified juvenile Velkari, a species known for forming intense emotional bonds with their caretakers, as low maintenance. The classification was based on their feeding requirements and habitat needs," the voice said defensively. "Emotional considerations were deemed secondary." "Secondary," Zoey repeated, looking down at Shadow, who was sleeping with one ear still turned toward the entrance, even in rest, maintaining his protective vigilance. Right. She took a deep breath and tried to channel her inner diplomat, a skill she'd been working on since her freshman year when she'd accidentally started an interspecies incident by pointing out flaws in the Centauri trade agreements during what was supposed to be a casual dinner conversation. "Commander, I think we have a systemic problem here," she said finally. "These cubs didn't just lose their handler, they lost their entire social structure. Velkari form pack bonds that are essentially family relationships. Imagine if you took human children and just moved them to a new family without any explanation or transition period." "The comparison is noted," Vexundra said, her scales shifting to a more thoughtful shade of blue-green. "But our immediate concern is containment and facility security." "They don't need to be contained," Zoey said, gently stroking Patches's head as he stirred slightly in his sleep. "They need to be comforted. They need consistency. They need someone to explain what happened and help them understand that they haven't been abandoned permanently." "Cadet," Qualmoth's buzzing voice interjected, "with respect to your unconventional success, these are still dangerous predators. Academy regulations require appropriate safety measures." Zoey looked around at the corridor, taking in the damaged equipment, the scorch marks on the walls, the general atmosphere of barely contained chaos that had characterized the morning's events. "Chief," she said mildly, "how exactly did those safety measures work out for you?" The silence that followed this observation was particularly eloquent. "The cadet raises valid concerns," came a new voice, one that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being listened to. "This is Dean Holloway. I've been monitoring the situation from the administrative level." Zoey felt her stomach drop slightly. Dean Holloway was a legend in xenobiology circles, a human who had spent decades studying interspecies relationships and had written the definitive texts on emotional bonding across different evolutionary backgrounds. She was also known for having very strong opinions about proper protocols and very little patience for students who improvised their way into dangerous situations. "Dean Holloway," Zoey said carefully. "I can explain." "Cadet," the dean interrupted, "you have just accomplished something that our entire security apparatus failed to achieve. You've also identified a significant flaw in our handling procedures that could have resulted in far more serious consequences. I think explanations can wait until we've properly addressed the immediate situation." Zoey blinked in surprise. That was not the response she'd been expecting. "However," Dean Holloway continued, and Zoey braced herself for the inevitable disciplinary consequences, "we do need to establish a more sustainable solution than having you personally provide comfort to 3 juvenile predators indefinitely." "Actually," Zoey said, an idea beginning to form, "I might have a suggestion about that." She carefully shifted her position, trying not to disturb the cubs too much as she adjusted her weight distribution. Ears opened one sleepy eye, assessed that nothing threatening was happening, and went back to sleep. "The original handler," she continued, "they're in Deep Space Survey now, right? That's usually a communication-accessible assignment." "The handler is currently stationed on Survey Ship Meridian," came the administrative voice from earlier. "Standard communication protocols would allow for real-time interaction." "So they could talk to the cubs? Video communication? Maybe even holographic projection for familiarity. Not the same as being physically present, but enough to provide continuity and explanation." There was a pause as various people considered this. "The cubs would need to understand what was happening," Dean Holloway said thoughtfully. "Velkari are intelligent enough to comprehend temporary separation, but they need the concept explained in terms they can process. They're also pack animals, Zoey added, warming to her theme. They need a temporary pack structure while they adjust. Someone they can bond with as a placeholder until they're ready to accept a new permanent handler. Someone, Commander Vexundra said, with what sounded suspiciously like amusement. Like a certain xenobiology cadet who has already demonstrated an unusual aptitude for interspecies communication. Zoey felt her cheeks warm slightly. I hadn't actually considered that possibility. Well, consider it now, Dean Holloway said briskly, because unless you have a better solution, I think we may have just found your practicum project for this semester. My practicum project? Supervised care and socialization of juvenile Velkari, with emphasis on emotional transition protocols and pack bonding behaviors. It's certainly more interesting than cataloging dietary preferences. Zoey looked down at the three cubs, who had somehow managed to arrange themselves into an even more comfortable configuration around her. Shadow had begun that subsonic purring that indicated deep contentment, while Patches was doing something that looked suspiciously like smiling in his sleep. She started, then stopped, overwhelmed by the enormity of what was being offered. I would be honored. Excellent, Dean Holloway said with satisfaction. Now, the immediate question is how we get you and your new charges back to a proper habitat, without traumatizing them further. Actually, Zoey said, glancing around the damaged corridor, I think they might be traumatized enough for one day. What if we brought the habitat to them? Elaborate. Mobile habitat unit. We can set up their familiar environmental controls right here, bring in their regular food, their sleeping materials, maybe some of their toys. Let them decompress in a space that feels safe before we try to move them anywhere. The corridor is hardly a suitable long-term solution, Qualmoth pointed out. Not long-term, Zoey agreed, just until we can establish communication with their original handler and start the transition process properly. A day, maybe two. And in the meantime? Zoey looked down at the cubs again, at their peaceful, trusting expressions, at the way they had instinctively formed a protective circle around her. In the meantime, I guess I'm going to learn a lot more about Velkari pack dynamics than I ever expected to. Over the next few hours, Zoey watched as the Academy's considerable resources were redirected toward what had to be the most unusual accommodation request in institutional history. Mobile habitat units appeared as if by magic, environmental controls were calibrated, and a small army of very confused maintenance staff worked around 3 sleeping predators and 1 increasingly stiff cadet. The breakthrough came when they established communication with handler Kev, the cub's original caretaker. The moment his voice came through the speakers, all 3 cubs were instantly alert, chirping and calling out in obvious recognition and joy. "Hello, my beautiful ones?" Kev's voice was warm with genuine affection, and Zoey could hear the pain of separation underneath. "I'm so sorry I had to leave without saying goodbye. I know you've been scared and confused." The cubs responded with a complex symphony of chirps, growls, and purrs that Zoey was beginning to understand was their way of expressing complex emotions. Relief, confusion, hurt, love, all tangled together in sounds that seemed to bypass language entirely. Over the next 30 minutes, Kev patiently explained the situation to the cubs in terms they could understand, using a mixture of verbal communication and gestural cues that the cubs clearly recognized. He introduced Zoey as their temporary pack leader, someone who would take care of them until a new permanent arrangement could be made. The moment when the cubs fully accepted this explanation was visible. Shadow approached Zoey and performed what she recognized as a formal pack acknowledgement gesture. touching his forehead briefly to her hand. Ears and patches followed suit, and just like that, she found herself with 3 highly intelligent, potentially dangerous, absolutely adorable adopted pack members. "Well," she said to no one in particular, "this is either going to be the best semester of my life or the shortest." 3 days later, Zoey sat in her newly expanded quarters, watching, as Patches attempted to teach Ears the finer points of holographic chess, while Shadow supervised from his position by the window. The cubs had adapted to their temporary situation with remarkable grace, especially once they understood it was temporary. Dean Holloway had been right. It was certainly more interesting than cataloging dietary preferences. It was also more work, more responsibility, and more rewarding than anything she'd ever done. "You know," she said to Shadow, who had appointed himself as her personal bodyguard, "when I started this semester, I thought I was going to study predator behavior from a safe distance." Shadow looked at her with those intelligent dark eyes and made a sound that she had learned was his equivalent of laughter. "Yeah," she said, reaching out to scratch behind his ears, in the spot that made him purr like a small engine. "I guess the universe had other plans." Outside her window, the academy continued its daily routine, training the next generation of officers and scientists and diplomats. But inside her quarters, a human cadet and 3 alien cubs were writing a new chapter in interspecies relationships, 1 smile, 1 meal, and 1 impromptu nap at a time. And if that wasn't worth a few bureaucratic headaches and some very confused paperwork, Zoey thought, then she didn't know what was.